Howdy everybody, welcome back to Stravera TV. Today we're going to be doing something completely different than usual, which seems to be becoming a recurring theme for this channel these days. We are going to be talking about one of my favorite bands of all time, fronted by one of my favorite musicians of all time, my main man Ronnie James Dio, famous for being in Black Sabbath, Rainbow, and Elf, and of course his self-titled band Dio. I'm going to assume that you're familiar with Dio's music if you've clicked on this video. For those of you who aren't, I would recommend going to listen to a few of his albums to get some context, and then coming back for a better understanding of what we're going to discuss today. We're going to be making a tier list today, all 10 of Dio's studio albums spanning from 1983 to 2004. So without further ado, let's go ahead and place our first album, and we're going to start from lowest to highest, and I'm going to go ahead and place Killing the Dragon down here in C tier, right about here for a little bit of foreshadowing. In a word, I would describe Killing the Dragon as vanilla. It's definitely my least favorite of Dio's work. Not without saving graces, of course. The standout songs for me are Guilty and Throwaway Children. They feature some really interesting guitar work and some cool composition, more so than the rest of the album, I think. Lyrically, those two are definitely the most interesting as well, in my opinion. The song Push is fun for like a workout jam or kind of like a hype track, but once you've heard it enough times, the magic kind of wears off of it and it gets a little repetitive and annoying. Placed against other bands, I'm sure this might go a little bit higher on a list, but marked against the others, there's definitely much better to pick from. So, next. As much as it really hurts me to do this because I love this album so much, I'm gonna have to put The Last in Line down here next to Killing the Dragon. In a word, I would probably call this album cheesy. It's very goofy and fun. I actually like every track on this album. The problem is that there's really not much variation between the tones of every track. It's all a little bit samey. It's a solid enough album. It's a lot of fun to blast in the car. But ultimately, it's definitely not Dio's best work. The composition isn't very interesting, despite the songs being a blast to just kind of, jam out to. The standout tracks are, of course, the titular Last in Line, Eat Your Heart Out, and One Night in the City. I just can't help but get a big stupid grin on my face whenever one of those two latter ones comes on. Next up, we're going to go ahead and throw Dream Evil up into the C category. In a word, I would call this album fun. It's more cheese and more camp, a little more goofiness. Standout tracks for me will be Overlove, Night People, and When a Woman Cries. Now this album does have good variation. There are some fast tracks and some slow tracks. However, All the Fools Sailed Away and Sunset Superman are both way too long and way too repetitive for their own good. It really does get to the point where it's bordering on being annoying. Especially when you're listening to the album as a whole, like sequentially in order. They really throw off the flow of the album because they are on the track list back to back, and combined they're about 13 minutes. So overall, Dream Evil, another middle-of-the-road album. Definitely, I know it's the lowest on the list so far in terms of our tiers, but it's not a bad album by any stretch. It's just lower down in comparison to the rest. You guys know how tier lists work. Next up, again, it feels weird to be putting this one so, I guess, comparatively low, because this is a great album. It's going to be Strange Highways. But again, even though it's relatively low, it's going up in B, and B is a good grade. That's better than what I usually got in school. In a word, I would call Strange Highways thrashy. There's a lot of really interesting composition. This is where we start to see the straight-up structure of the songs becoming just as interesting as the sounds they're producing. I think the song Firehead is probably the best example of this. If you skip into it about 2 minutes and 20 seconds, I think you'll hear what I'm talking about. Other standouts are, of course, the fantastic Jesus, Mary, and Holy Ghost, and Pain. But, unfortunately, and this is why this album is so low, I'm really not a fan of most of the other tracks. Bring Down the Rain is okay, but Hollywood Black and Give Her the Gun, and I guess the rest are just a little bit generic. It's totally worth it for the great tracks that are on this album, but as a whole, I'm gonna have to put this one closer to the bottom center. And speaking of center, I do think this one kind of belongs in the almost dead middle, as close to the dead middle as we can get, and that is going to be Sacred Heart. In a word, I would call the Sacred Heart album energizing. Standout tracks for me are, of course, the titular Sacred Heart, which I think is probably the most fun song on this entire discography. King of Rock and Roll is fantastic, and Like the Beat of a Heart is another good one of those like workout songs or like hype tracks. This album is full of catchy riffs and poetic vocals, and it comes in at a tight 9 tracks. Unfortunately, a lot of them are kind of similar when it comes to tone and structure. There's not a lot of variation, and a little bit of it is just a little too slow, like tempo-wise for my taste. Like it almost feels like they're dragging a little bit, even though the songs themselves aren't that long. This is a pretty much dictionary definition of a middle-of-the-road album. It has a lot of great and a little bit of not so great, so I think middle of B tier is exactly where this belongs. Next up is DIO's final album from 2004, Master of the Moon. In a word, I'd call this album ominous. It almost feels like each track is trying to say something without words, like the feelings that they inspire, just from tone alone to get their messages across. My problem with this album is that, just like a few of the other ones that we've gone over so far, is that it really is all kind of samey, and it's a good sound. It's a good sound that each track has, but it's all very similar to the previous one and the next one. But standouts for this album, I would say, are probably End of the World, The Man Who Would Be King, and The Eyes, which is another long one that might drag on a little bit for some people, but for me, it has enough variation. As it gets closer to the ends, it's just one of those long fade-out songs. I'm sure you've heard it, but for me, it works. One other thing I'd want to say about Master of the Moon is that the mix quality is superb. Dio's voice just sounds so crystal clear compared to, say, the original recording of Sacred Heart, not the remaster. It's just like an auditory treat to just listen to this album back to front. This is an objectively good album, but subjectively there are still others that I do prefer. I think Being Next to Sacred Heart is... you know what, actually, we're going to make our first change. I'm actually going to go ahead and swap Sacred Heart and Master of the Moon, because I think Sacred Heart has more songs on it that I like. And I suppose for a completely emotional reason, I have fonder memories of this one than Master of the Moon. So there we go. Okay, so now we're getting into the 4 Dio albums that I like the most, and that's why these placements were so hard to really finalize. And it really hurts. It hurts to be putting this in B tier, because I want it to belong higher, but it's going to have to be Lock Up the Wolves. That's going to have to go in front of B. Lock Up the Wolves was my favorite Dio album for a long time, until I really listened to a few of the other ones, namely the rest of the 3 that we're going to see in a few minutes, more and more, and kind of gained more appreciation for them. In a word, I would call Lock Up the Wolves foreboding. This whole thing has a really spooky vibe to it, almost like an unintentional like Halloween album. It's really good in October. This album has great variations between fast and slow songs. Standout tracks for me being Born on the Sun, Why Are They Watching Me, and My Eyes, which is just beautiful. When I picture metal in the 80s and 90s, the guitar on this album is just what immediately comes to mind for me. My only issues is that I really don't care for Twisted and Walk on Water. Wild One also goes on like a little bit too long for my tastes. So overall, like half this album, more than half of it, most of it is like way up here for me. Like if we were doing individual tracks, some of these would be up in S, or if there was an S+, it'd be up there. But for big picture whole albums, Lock Up the Wolves, fortunately, it pains me to say it, is going down in B. So this is it. We've come down to the final 3, my 3 favorite Dio albums. This one I'm sure is going to be no surprise to most of you who are familiar with his work that it's in my top 3. But next up in the list is going to have to be Angry Machines, going right up there in A. This album came out 6 days after I was born in 1996. You're welcome. Anyway, in a word, I would call Angry Machines doom. I mean, this album is metal as heck, yo. This album has an absolutely superb track lineup. Many standouts. I really like Hunter of the Heart. Like that song is sick. Like it's great dynamics. There's a wicked cool guitar solo. It's just it's a great song. Don't Tell the Kids is pretty good. Big Sister is a standout. And I think the best song on this album is probably This Is Your Life, just because it's so different than anything else we've really touched on, except for maybe My Eyes so far, throughout the albums that we've discussed. It's just a really pretty, like, emotional, almost mournful sounding song. it just comes so far out of left field compared to the rest of the album, which is very kind of heavy. Like it really is the closest thing that I would consider to like a heavy metal album, like as far as this whole discography goes. So yeah, this album is a lot of high-octane metal tracks with some dark, spooky fantasy lyrics, and they all culminate in a really sad song about the finality of your life and what we make of it. And once the album starts with Institutional Man, you know what you're in for. This is just a very well-executed listening experience, I think, and while vastly different from the older and newer Dio albums alike, I think that's exactly what I like about it. So this is it, only 2 left. And some of you might see this coming, some of you might not. I'm gonna have to do the obvious thing and put Holy Diver in A! That's right, Magica is my favorite Dio album, and I'm gonna put it up in S. So, let's start with Holy Diver. In a word, this album is obviously fantasy. This is truly classic Dio. This is probably the best representation of his work as a whole. You really can't pick standout songs. The only one I don't like off of this album is Gypsy, and even then, it's a good song. I just don't like it as much as I like most of the other tracks that are on here. I mean, look at them. Unfortunately, and this is gonna sound pretty familiar, a lot of them are kind of a little samey, without really much variation between the way that the songs sound. However, there's a good mix of high-energy songs and slower jams. There really is no overstating this album's quality or understating its influence. Of course, this isn't where Dio the man started, the musician, but this is where Dio the band began. Holy Diver was great foreshadowing for all that was to come after, and if you're looking to get into Dio, there is truly no better place to start than here, at the beginning. So yes, my favorite Dio album is Magica from the year 2000. I hope you can all appreciate how difficult it is for me to pick a favorite out of these albums, because Dio is probably in my top favorite bands of all time. This is like picking between your favorite children. Like, it really is that difficult for me. I spent a long time figuring out what goes where on this list. But yes, Magica is my favorite Dio album. Right at the top, up in the S tier. In a word, I would describe the sound of Magica as gloom. It's really not easy to even pick standout tracks because they all pretty much are really good, but in this whole lineup of albums, I truly do believe that Magica definitely rises above the rest of them on repeat listening. It's full of variation between tracks, it's very interesting composition-wise, there's a lot of time changes and complex play of every instrument, including the vocals. The song Losing My Insanity starts with a fairly drawn-out instrumental portion, which is very rare for most of Dio's songs. And it's a welcome swap of structure from the first 9 in the album that came before. It's the 10th track on the album. As Long as It's Not About Love is a beautiful, slow song that has a very palpable and real sense of pain and suffering. It's perfectly executed. Feed My Head has a truly sick breakdown and super dramatic guitar solo about halfway through, and Fever Dreams is just an absolute jam. That's another great one for working out to, or, hyping yourself up or blasting down the highway. Every song on this album has something cool about it that's worth discussing. And to make this whole experience even better, the album is bookended and peppered through with these interludes of robotic beeping and ambience, as well as a computerized voice guiding you through the album as a whole. It's great. It's just great. I love it. So here you go, metalheads. This is my definitive tier list for Dio's albums in order. I absolutely adore Dio's music. I'm sure that's painfully obvious to you at this point. And if you do as well, I encourage you to make a list of your own and come back at me with it and explain to me why you dispute or agree with my claims. Thank you very much for watching, metal fans. We'll see you in the next video, partners. Whatever the hell that's gonna be.